Just a few things first. As you are well aware, I imagine next week is Thanksgiving on Monday. So we won't have any class on Monday. No class, no office hours. I won't be here since you won't be here. So I guess the way things will work out is today we're going to cover like highlights and different applications of Chapter 6 and 5. And what would normally be next week is the appendix of Chapter 6, which is short in essence. Like, it's not that long to cover that. It's not that much material. Not that much that is normally covered on the final. It still is covered, but it's not the biggest of the chapters. Compared to this week, we're kind of covering 2. So the way I'm going to do it is I will record the Thursday class instead. So you guys who are normally doing it in classroom on the Monday, you could just watch that video and you'll have access to it. So like by Friday, you should have access to it. Normally it takes a bit of processing time just with YouTube and everything else. But yeah, so you'll have that next Friday. And worst comes to worst, like not this coming Monday because we won't be together, but the following one. If you have questions on the appendix of Chapter 6, we can figure somehow to include that with Chapter 7, which we'll be covering. Okay, so watch the video next week. Don't come to class because you don't have class. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, for our pre-week quizzes, there's one like every week. So even though it's Thanksgiving Monday next week, you still have a pre-week quiz, and the reason behind it is you have any time from tomorrow till next Monday to complete it. So like if you don't want to work Thanksgiving Monday, it makes sense, but make sure you do it either tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then you'll have Monday off, but you still have the same timeline to complete on the Monday. Okay? Any questions? Okay, awesome. So that's for the planning going forward. And at the end of the semester, we have like extra time. So if ever there's some things that need to be more clarified, we still have that kind of a class that recovers the time lost from next Monday. But I think we'll be fine either way. So for today's class, Chapter 6, which deals with surplus, so either consumer or producer surplus. In Chapter 5, that deals with price controls. Is there any question? Or on any other thing that we've covered in the past quizzes, past anything? Anything that's not clear? No? So I guess the common theme that's kind of going on, which works out good for this semester, is thinking about a lot of these concepts in light of COVID, so in light of what's going on these days. So throughout the class, I'll kind of talk for a little bit, but not too long. But throughout this whole process, try to think about if there's any price controls that were either introduced or some that you think could be introduced in these kind of pandemic times where some people are losing their jobs. It's much more hard to pay your bills. Certain costs are going up drastically, certain aren't changing too much. So what can the government do to help out people, help out businesses, and how is that beneficial but also harmful? Because the thing that we notice with price controls, if you've gone through the videos and the discussion, is that price controls generally have a kind of like a good purpose, but there's this harmful impact that always kicks in. So price controls always have there's always like a good purpose in mind, but there's always some people that lose. There's always some losers in this whole process. So I typically cover Chapter 6 before covering Chapter 5. Just because it makes price controls easier to understand and to analyze once you understand the concept of surplus. For you guys, you're assumed to have covered both already before coming up today. So I don't really mind starting one or the other. But overall, if we think about price controls, I'll just keep going with that a little bit longer, is the common theme that I'll have in any example on a final exam is you're often going to be talked about a certain price control, and I'm going to say who is the gaining category, like who is the gaining category, who gains. This is just making it very shorter than the actual question. Who loses? But then the one that people think about the least is who of the gaining category loses. So that's the one I find the most important because it's not the one that people think about too much. Who of the gaining category loses? So if I think about minimum wage legislation, we increase minimum wage. Like we could easily go through this, and it's been gone through the videos. So let's get you guys to mention it. Who gains from a minimum wage going up? Like if it goes up to $15, who's the main people gaining from this? Yeah.
The workers.
Yeah. So the workers that currently earn minimum wage, that will see their wages rise. I don't gain. I'm a worker, but I'm not earning minimum wage. So yeah, who gains? Workers paid under new minimum wage. Because if it goes up to 15 and you're paid 14 now, you might be over the minimum wage. But as soon as your wage goes up because of this, so workers that see a wage increase. Yeah. Who loses? Yeah.
Small business.
Yeah. So well, not just a small business. You could be a very, very large business that has a really high percentage of your workers being minimum wage workers. And it hurts your bottom line as well. So any business, yeah. And Bishops could be a business on that respect too, or any other kind of employer, any employer, a business employer who sees some of their workers wages go up. Okay. And last but not least, yeah.
I'd say being loses the most from the gaining section is the people because of inflation.
Okay, you could think about inflation is also one of the losers potentially. So that would be kind of like another category that loses. So you could think about people that are suffering inflation, yes. But the third question asks, who of the gaining category loses? Yeah.
Well, we can think of workers being laid off.
Exactly. So workers being laid off. So in this whole grand scheme of things, like, yes, we can analyze this graphically with consumer surplus and producer surplus, but we could easily analyze it just with words and understanding. And if you want to be convinced by it, yes, by using a graph and showing how this price control, in this case here it's a price floor, could be implemented and what kind of impact it can have. It could be seen graphically quite rapidly, so we could kind of prove this as well. But this would be more the kind of question that would be like, explain to your grandmother what would happen if minimum wages goes up or something else. Okay. So if we think about this pandemic, what may have had a price control, or what are the things that the government could have stepped in and said, we're going to introduce a price control here? Okay, so we talked about earlier, I believe in this class, maybe in my macro class, but we talked about things that changed in price a lot over this, like before the start of the summer and now. And if you think about some of those goods, well, the government could have kind of stepped in and controlled it and say, well, we don't want the prices of this to increase, so we're going to introduce a price control. So give me any example that you have. Yeah.
Did you mention wood?
Yeah. Okay, so let's say I introduce a price control on wood. So if I were to introduce a price control on wood, what would it be? So here, we're kind of just setting the scene, but something that needs to be clear to you is, first, what's the difference between a price floor and a price ceiling, and what makes a price floor or price ceiling binding? So here, a price control on wood, would it likely be a price floor or price ceiling that the government would introduce? Price ceiling, yeah. So price control on wood would be a ceiling. And for a ceiling to be binding, where does that price ceiling have to be with respect to the price before we introduce this price ceiling?
It has to be above the equilibrium price.
Above the equilibrium price? Below the equilibrium price. Okay, perfect. It has to be set below. Because if I have a price ceiling that is above, it tells me, price ceiling is the other way around. It tells me that the price has to be this ceiling price or lower. Well, if the current equilibrium is below it, it's not going to have an impact. If I put a price ceiling of $3 per liter on gasoline right now, it won't change anything. It's currently selling for less than $3 a liter. The only thing it could change is, let's say instead of $3, it's like the price ceiling is $1.20. Well, if you're about to purchase a vehicle and you know that the government's going to introduce a price ceiling and said for the next 5 years there's going to be a price ceiling on gasoline at $1.20. Well, if you're thinking about buying a new vehicle, well, that Toyota pickup truck that you're eyeing is much more appealing if you know that the price of gasoline is going to stay low. It's going to be either around what it is now and up to $1.20 is the very maximum. So it might not have an impact now, but it might have an impact on your purchases if you know that it's not going to be allowed to go beyond something. But it is not yet binding. So what we mean by binding is just a word of being like tied up in a certain way. Well, a non-binding price ceiling is it's not prohibiting us from being at the free market price. A binding price ceiling is a price ceiling set below that binds us because we cannot go to the current equilibrium price. We can charge the price ceiling or anything below it, but what is currently being charged is above that, so we're not allowed to charge it. So price ceiling on wood. So like I said, from the early summer to now, some wood products like 2x4s and plywood pretty much doubled in price. So maybe a piece of BC fir plywood, which used to sell for, let's say, 30 and is now selling for 60, well, we could say, let's put a price ceiling of 45 on it. Something like that would be our price ceiling. That price ceiling last year would not have been binding. Binding, once again, a non-binding price ceiling has no impact at the moment that we're talking about. A binding price ceiling is one that has an impact on the equilibrium. So setting a price ceiling below the current equilibrium is binding. Yeah. If we introduce this price ceiling, so we kind of know binding versus non-binding, price ceiling versus price floors. So if we think about this whole three-step approach, who gains from this price ceiling? Customers buying wood. So wood buyers or plywood buyers. Yeah. Who loses? Yeah, the company selling the wood. And who of the gaining category loses?
Eventually the customers also.
Why?
Well, because they're going to stop producing the bruisable stuff since it's not profitable. So
Might not stop, but it's going to be very hard to find. It'll be like long delays and stuff like that. So the people unable to buy wood. So always keep in mind that any price control that you might see or hear about people talk could often lead to this scenario. I say often, I say most of the time, but in practice it all depends what reality really is. What I mean by that is The only kind of explanation I could see that might be slightly different in this scenario here is the reason why the wood is currently selling for more is because they weren't able to produce it for the longest time because the plants were closed and everything else, and where they were cutting the wood. So they kind of fell back and they had to work under capacity and so on, so their production costs went up, and that production cost got passed on to the consumer. So we saw from an elasticity point of view last class that these wood products don't have many substitutes, and because they have not many substitutes, people are inelastic to, they don't really respond much to a change in price. They do respond, but not as much than something that had a lot of substitutes, like wood siding has brick and other products that could be put on the walls other than wood. Whereas a piece of plywood is hard to replace. So because of that, an increase in cost faced, if I think about my demand and supply curve, I could think, well, my demand curve, if people don't respond much, is it going to be very steep or very flat? Very steep, yeah. So if I think about this, I have this demand curve. This demand curve for plywood might be like this. And then I have my supply curve. Well, as soon as production costs go up, well, I know that production cost goes up. For a given quantity, I will need to receive a higher price, so my supply curve shifts left. Well, if I compare this point here to this point here, the amount of units sold goes down a little bit, but the price goes up a lot. So a lot of that cost gets pushed onto the consumer. A lot of that increase in cost gets pushed onto the consumer. So if that's the case, and you force companies to charge a lesser amount because of a price ceiling, you might have companies saying, we don't want to produce. Our cost of production are too high. We're not going to sell this product anymore. We're not going to sell as much. We're going to make sure that we are profitable in the whole process. So that is a situation where you have people unable to buy wood. The flip side, which might be trickier, but this is harder to prove, is if currently the wood producers, the people who kind of prepare the plywood and everything else, used COVID as a way to kind of boost up their price and act as a monopoly. We'll talk about this when we get to Chapter 11 on oligopoly and cartels and everything else. It's illegal to kind of price fix. So if Labatt and Molson or big companies kind of come together and say, hey, should we increase the price of beer because people are staying at home and they're drinking a lot of beer, let's just increase it, and they kind of act as a monopoly together. That is unfair practices and it's illegal. Same thing as many years ago around Magog, there was a lot of gasoline sellers that all agreed to increase their price together, and that's illegal. Like, you're not allowed to act as a monopoly. You're supposed to have a certain level of competition. Well, with wood producers, it's possible that some of these wood producers kind of contacted each other and said, hey, how about we start charging higher? And if we all do the same thing at the same time, we're going to make more money this summer. That's possible that it happened. Some people think that's what's going on. And if that is the case, if we introduce a price ceiling on them, well, if their production costs aren't that much higher, they might still be supplying at that lower price. So that's kind of the flip side. But generally speaking, anytime you introduce a price control on a market that is going well, that is not behaving illegally, you will always have a gaining category or a losing category, or maybe two losing categories, two gaining categories. But from the people gaining, there's always losers. It's a big thing we have to keep in mind. Yeah. Same thing if we were to talk about like increase in price on Purell or face mask or whatever else, and say we're going to put a price control that limits that price increase. Well, it's going to be beneficial for the businesses selling this product, but it's not going to be, it's going to be beneficial for the people buying this product, but some of these people might not be able to find the product anymore. So if we think like if we think about grocery stores in this pandemic, what has happened? Like we have to kind of go back towards the beginnings, but grocery workers were seen kind of like essential workers for a certain amount of time, because like if you need to eat, you need to go to the grocery store. So what did the government do to grocery store workers? Increase wages, yeah. So was that the government, or was that your employer paying that increase in wages? Yeah, no. So generally speaking, if it was mandated by the government, often it's the government that will kind of subsidize that. I'd have to look into the specific example this time around, but I'm pretty sure it's the government that paid it, and that's why businesses kept on operating. And then otherwise, the big thing that we want to make sure in these kind of pandemic times is that as people are losing their jobs, they're still able to nourish themselves. Well, it would have been possible to say that some of these products would have gone up in price due to rarity and everything else, because the companies producing these food products are working on their capacity. They have higher costs. And normally the price would increase, but the government could also step in and say you're not allowed to increase the price on this specific good to the consumer, which is beneficial for the consumer. But if the company that's the grocery store that's selling you product can't increase the price on their product, and they have to pay people more if it wasn't subsidized, it'd be a really hard thing on grocery stores. They'd be like stressed financially during this period. So to avoid that from happening and making grocery stores probably close their doors and everything else, you got to make sure that if you force wage increases, in this case, it's probably the government footing the bill as much as possible. And then if there's certain things that would go up in price, how could you control it without hurting specific people too much? What else kind of happened in terms of price controls? Any other ideas or examples?
Toilet paper?
Yeah, toilet paper. Yeah, so we talked Purell, toilet paper, wood. Was there price controls on toilet paper?
Other than the limit that you could buy.
Yeah, so it's more based on a limit that you can buy instead of an actual price control that limited the price. What they're trying to avoid here is a situation that a lot of people hoarding product would try to increase the price drastically and make it less available to other people. And to avoid that from happening is just setting limits on how people can buy. So to avoid those massive shifts in temporary increase in demand, to stock up and making the price a whole lot higher. So limits does protect that quite a bit. Anything else? So anyone who had or has a mortgage, there is some form of temporary reliefs on those mortgages and everything else. So it makes that if you're kind of losing and you don't have that much money, you can kind of save for a certain amount of time. So there's other things that kind of happen in this period. Yeah. Question?
No, I was just going like wasn't there like some kind of mandation that made like if you were renting and lost your job because of COVID, you didn't have to pay rent?
Yeah, there's something along those lines as well.
I think the government said like they were encouraging owners to do it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like an obligation.
Yeah. And I know like some banks kind of had like you can be kind of like fall short on your payments for a certain amount of time. There's relief packages as well.
Like you don't have to pay your student loans. I think it starts in a few days.
Yeah.
Everyone that has student loans haven't paid since March.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a bunch of these relief packages is offered. So yeah, definitely, for sure. Cool. So yeah, make sure for price controls you understand who gains, who loses, who from the gaining category loses. If you were to draw it out, make sure you know which one is price ceiling, price floor. So always to know if a price ceiling or price floor is binding, is the way I see it is it has to be the opposite of what the current situation is in. So what I like to think is in the middle at the equilibrium is a small human being. And if he has a ceiling over his head and a floor below him, everything's normal. So nothing's really happening. but it's when the ceiling's below you or your floor is above you that there's an impact, like something's having an impact on you. Okay, so something's wrong, or not something's wrong, but something's definitely happening. Okay? So price ceiling above market price has no impact. Price floor below has no impact. So other questions that you might see in multiple choice type questions, just to kind of go over everything just to be prepared, is you might be given a graph, or you might be given a table with different prices and quantity supplied, quantity demanded. And you might be given at this table here, I say, let's say $1.50, and this is $1, this is 200. There would be more information given than that. But let's say at a price ceiling of $1.50, how many units would be sold? At a price ceiling of $1.50, how many units would be sold? Yeah. 300. No. No, it's good. It's good. If you're making mistakes now and you figure it out, that's the way to do it. So at a price ceiling of $1.50, how many units would be sold? Yes.
Like 150, if I'm reading that number right.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, poor writing. 150, 200, 300. Yeah. Still not the right answer. Okay, so we were given 300, we were given 150. There's only one left. Okay? Yeah.
200, right?
200. Yes, you got the right answer. Perfect. 200 is the right answer. Awesome. Why is it 200 though? Because like that 150 could have been right, but it isn't in this case. Why is it not?
Because the price is already one, so the pricing doesn't change anything.
Exactly. Here's what I just kind of illustrated, and I mentioned it again. The equilibrium price is $1. I set a price ceiling of $1.50, not a price floor of $1.50. A price ceiling of $1.50 has no impact. Therefore, disregard this curve altogether. It's not changing anything. Price ceiling $1.50. If the equilibrium price is $1, won't change the price. A price ceiling, as I mentioned, is something that protects prices from going up. It might be binding, it might not be binding. Okay, so right now, like I said, it's possible for the government, if we were a big producer of, I don't know, gas-powered cars, and you wanted people to keep on buying gas-powered cars, if it's electric cars, you could say, well, we're going to introduce a price ceiling of $1.20 a liter on gasoline. That way we know that even in the past, we've had like close to $1.50 a liter gasoline. Now it's lower. It's never going to creep up above $1.20 as long as this price ceiling holds. Okay, it's not common practice to having a price ceiling set above the equilibrium price that has no impact. I agree with that, but it can happen. It's just making sure that you understand the mechanics of a price ceiling and a price floor. That's the biggest thing. And there is one good out there that has both a price ceiling and a price floor. Which good do you think it is?
Gas?
No, there's not even a price ceiling or price floor in gas. There's nothing on it. Yeah. Well, as far as I know, but yeah. Milk. Milk's the only thing that will have a price ceiling or a price floor. So no matter what supermarket you go, price won't be able to be below a certain price, because they're trying to protect the producers of this milk to make sure that they get kind of a decent amount of money. And if you go to a convenience store, like, milk can't be severely overpriced. That's one of those goods. Yeah?
Like specifically dairy milk? Or
Yeah. I don't think soy milk's protected everything else. So for the non-dairy drinkers like myself, it doesn't really change much, but yeah. Yeah, that's the classic example typically. Unless they've changed it, that's the one that has kind of a bit of protection on both ends. Yeah. But once again, that ceiling and that floor might be non-binding. Like most places that you go to would charge a price that would be somewhere in between the two, and it wouldn't really have an impact. But it prevents small businesses that really want to scam you from overcharging for milk. It prevents big businesses that drive out like competition or take advantage of milk producers from charging too little. Okay? So coming back to this example, make sure first off, always in a graph or a table form, ask yourself, does this price, this example that's given to me, does it have an impact? And that was the trick in this one here. It did not have an impact. Okay. Second, if it has an impact. So now second question for you guys, not the same answer. Now we are talking about a price floor of $1.50. How many units will be sold at a price floor of $1.50? So price floor has an impact. It's above, so the floor is above your head. Something's wrong. Okay. What's going on? Price floor of $1.50. How many units will be sold? Yeah.
150.
150. That is the right answer. Okay. It will never be the greater quantity than the equilibrium quantity. Never, ever, ever, ever. Okay. So that kind of goes into the surplus discussion a little bit. If you have, let's say, I look at this here, and I have my usual supply and demand curve. Okay. This is my equilibrium price and quantity. No matter what other price that we have in the market, due to a price control, due to a tax, due to anything out there. If we have a mandated price, whatever, we will never have a quantity above Q star. There is kind of like an example just to like illustrative purposes in the notes and video that talk about like producing more, overproducing, and how it's not efficient. But you cannot force people to overproduce and overconsume if it goes beyond what you're charging and what you value the product. All the examples that we're going to see, whether it's price controls, price floors, or taxes, will all lead to a situation where the quantity exchange will always be less than Q star. Q star is the maximum that we have. Why is this the case? Okay. Well, if I think about it this way here, we said that it's price floors above P star that have an impact. Okay. If the price floor is set below, it's just going to go to P star because it's saying it has to be this price or higher. And the equilibrium price is feasible, so that's the one that it's going to be. So if the price floor is above, well, what happens if the price floor is here? Well, you could say it's either going to be this quantity or this quantity. I'm giving it graphical form, but you could also have it in a table form in a multiple choice question on a quiz or exam. But if I look at this price here, why is it this quantity and not this quantity? Why? I'm giving you the answer that it is, but why is it that way? Yeah, well, I kind of said that it can never go past the Q star, but why do we stop if the price is here, the price floor is here? Why do we stop here, let's say Q1, and not go all the way to Q2? Okay. So here, price changes, chapter 3, price changes does not lead to shifts in supply and demand. Supply or demand has not shifted. However, this higher price here, I know that at this higher price, that is binding because it's price floor, this is my price, this will be my quantity demanded for that specific price. And over here, this is going to be my quantity supplied. I have suppliers that would like to supply a greater quantity because they're now receiving more than they used to receive at P star. They would be happy to supply more. But there isn't enough buyers wanting to buy that product at that price. There's only this amount of units desired to be purchased at that price, and there's this amount of units that are willing to be sold, well, it's the first of the two that you intersect. As soon as you intersect either quantity supplied or the supply curve or the demand curve, you stop. For a given price, as soon as you intersect with one of the curves, you stop. So if the price floor was over here, I would come here and I would stop. This would be my quantity, not all the way over here and stop. Once again, it's because at this much higher price, even though I have a bunch of sellers willing to sell a great quantity, if there's only a few buyers willing to buy it, we stop there. You cannot force buyers to buy a product. Well, what happens if we have price ceilings below? Well, price ceilings below, let's say this is a price ceiling, so it has to be this price or lower. The equilibrium price cannot hold. Well, once again, I go across here, I have one quantity here, and then I have another quantity here. Why can it not be the second quantity? Yeah?
Because you don't have enough. Because the supply curve, you stop there.
Exactly. So even though there's a lot of consumers that would like to buy this product, at this price, there's only this amount of quantity that is supplied. You cannot get to the next side. So that's why I say that for any price like that is above or below the equilibrium price, this would be the quantity. This would be the quantity. And so on and so forth. And then I reach here, which is, if I think about it, the path from this vertical line all the way across horizontally until I reach one of the curves. The longest line that I will have is right here where they both intersect. And then when I start going below, the line's going to be smaller and smaller and smaller again. That's why the most I will supply, the most that will be exchanged, because the quantity exchange is always going to be the lesser of quantity supplied and quantity demanded. The most that's going to be exchanged is at the free market quantity. Anything else, any of the other prices will lead to what we call underproduction. Later on, when we talk about taxation, it's also going to lead to underproduction. Underproduction, when we talk about underproduction, we're always talking relative to free market. Free market, and free market is P star, Q star, let's say. It's always relative to the free market outcome. If we have a tax, this is going like towards the very end of this this class, but when we have a tax, we're creating this distortion between the price paid and the price received, and it's also going to lead to some level of underproduction as well. All of this applies, this whole idea applies until we reach the very last chapter we're going to cover in this class, chapter 16, which deals with environmental damages. Once we introduce environmental damages, we no longer say that the free market outcome is the optimal outcome, but that's at the only last chapter that it's the only time that will apply is if we have like pollution as a bystander or whatever of production. Then we'll talk that this is not the most efficient. But otherwise, this is the most efficient outcome. Efficient, so Q star or the free market outcome is efficient. We say also that it leads to the max total surplus, which is consumer plus producer surplus. Or we could also call it total economic surplus, or we could say that it's the max social welfare. Just treat all of these three ways of saying it to mean exactly the same thing. And up to this point, we haven't talked about taxation revenue, which is collected by the government, so it's not completely lost. And we'll add that to surplus. We'll have consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus tax revenue. And if you were to do studies with more of an environmental side of things, you could talk about like removing environmental damages, but that's not covered in this class, that aspect. But generally speaking, up to this point, total surplus or any of these surpluses is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Okay. Anyone have any questions or clarifications with regards to consumer surplus, producer surplus, concepts of willingness to pay, of cost of production, why they're going up? Anything that's unclear along all of those lines? No? The big thing that kind of screws with people and some graphs that they might have is the idea of debt weight loss to society. And it's always to keep in mind, well, what would be my total surplus, total economic surplus, or social welfare in the case I had the free market equilibrium? And it would be this whole area here. And then when we talk about loss to society or debt weight loss or the loss of social welfare, it's looking at after this price control policy has been introduced, or after this tax has been introduced, or something else has been introduced, what has been the impact on social welfare? So if I kind of just draw a new graph, because this one's getting messy. Okay. In that case, if your goal is to find what area is lost, you don't care too much about producer surplus or consumer surplus, but I'll just kind of care about it a little bit just to kind of talk a little bit more about the story of, let's say, we're talking about wood here. Okay. So this is the new equilibrium this summer. Wood selling for, let's say, $60. And early on in the summer, wood would have been selling for less because supply curve wouldn't have shifted left due to increase in production costs. So you would have been probably somewhere over here with a smaller price. This shifted. This is the current price. But we decided to introduce a price control of 45. The only way 45 can have an impact is it needs to be, because it's below, it needs to be a price ceiling. If it's a price floor, I would put the arrows the other way. It's either that price or higher, and the 60 would be possible. Right now, by saying it has to be 45 or lower, this is not possible. The free market situation is not possible. We know that in the free market situation, this whole area here would be my total surplus. But when we come back to this example here, what would be my producer and consumer surplus in this example? Well, first off, we know that if there's a binding price ceiling below the equilibrium price, so it's binding, they're going to charge 45. They're not going to charge even lower. It doesn't make sense. If you say you could only charge maximum 45 and they're currently charging 60, they won't go like, okay, we'll charge $20. Like, it wouldn't make any sense. So they're always going to charge at the maximum. So we know that the price is 45. Once again, will it be 100, 150, or 200 units will be sold at $45 with this price ceiling? How many units will be exchanged? 100. Okay, good. Okay, so we have to stop as soon as that price we intersect with either supply or demand, we go down, and that is our quantity. If you have a table chart and they're given like quantity supplied and quantity demanded for different prices, so you have price here, you have quantity supplied, quantity demanded, and you have your price, and you verify that it is a binding price ceiling or price floor, and you see like a price of $3, and you see quantity supplied 200 and quantity demanded 600. It's always going to be the lesser of the two. Same idea as it is done graphically here. Yes?
You said when you first began that graph was what is the area lost? So would what was lost be 50 units?
So we'll get to that. That's where we're getting to. Yeah. So first off, we need to establish the price. Then we establish the quantity. Why do we need to do this? Well, now as soon as I establish that there's only 100 units sold, even though I won't wipe it clean, I know that nothing's going to happen to the right of this 100 units. I cannot gain surplus over here as I gained beforehand because these units are not getting sold. So even though the willingness to pay is greater than the production cost on each of these units, they're not getting sold, so nothing's happening there. So it is good for me or anyone here to establish what quantity is being sold so that I know that everything I'm going to be looking at in terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus has to happen to the left of that quantity sold. Because I cannot, those units are not getting sold. There's underproduction due to this price control. So we are no longer getting to that equilibrium free market quantity of 150 here. That's why I took time to make sure you guys understand that we're only producing and selling 100 units because of this. So here we are, $45, 100 units sold. If I split up my area, what you would have sometimes, you could have like split up the area, call this area A, B, C, D, and E. Okay. The only reason I'm labeling it now is so that you don't have to come up to the blackboard and tell me what area you think consumer surplus is or producer surplus. By splitting it up, you could simply tell me, I think this area will represent consumer surplus. So in this case here, what area is consumer surplus? What letters? Could be one or it could be a multiple of letters. Yeah. A and B. So consumer surplus is A and B. Anyone say otherwise? Good, that's the right answer. It's A and B. How do I establish consumer surplus? Well, the demand curve represents my willingness to pay. How much I'm willing to pay. So for that first unit I purchased, I'm willing to pay a lot. And as I get more and more units, I'm willing to pay less and less money for those additional units. Think about anything you buy. If you buy more of a specific good, you're going to be willing to pay less and less for each extra unit of that good. So that's the situation that we have here. What is the price paid? 45. So on that first unit, all of this area between the willingness to pay and the price paid is my consumer surplus on this product. Consumer surplus, consumer surplus. In this case, I even got consumer surplus on the last product, which wouldn't be the case if we stopped at the free market equilibrium, because that's where production costs and consumer surplus meet, and that's why we normally stop in the absence of government regulation. In this case here, we cannot consume those extra 50 units. They're not available. At $45, we saw that even though the quantity of demand would be 200 units, there's only going to be 100 units produced. Therefore, there's going to be 100 people that want to buy units, like 1 unit each, let's say, that won't be able to find them. Like we said earlier, some buyers of plywood may not be able to find it. So that all of that is reflected in this graph. It's all reflected in this story. And how about producer surplus? What is producer surplus in this case? C. Exactly. C. Once again, when you look at this, like I said, once you establish the quantity, D and E, I knew from the get-go, will never be part of consumer surplus or producer surplus after this price control, because anything to the right of this quantity exchange is gone. It's lost. It existed in the free market exchange where we had equilibrium price and quantity. Now, due to this price control we have under production, these units are not exchanged. D and E is gone. It's disappeared. And it's what we will call deadweight loss, because typically all of this would have been my social welfare, my total economic surplus. And now I see that A and B is consumer surplus. C is my producer surplus. So D and E must be my deadweight loss, DWL for short, or my loss of social welfare, whatever you want to call it. That's what it means. Why is C my producer surplus? Well, this is the price that the producer receives. All of these points represents their production cost for the first, second, third, so on units. So that extra amount that they get above their cost. So this is their revenue, this is their cost, this is their profit on each of those units. And that is my situation post price control. Everyone understand? Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
What was the name for the lost stuff there, like the DWL?
DWL is so for long is dead weight loss. That's what DWL stands for. But you could also call it a loss of economic surplus, a loss of social welfare, whichever one that you want to call it. It's just a bunch of synonyms we can say that mean the same thing. Any other questions or comments? No? We're good? Awesome. Well, I'd rather have you active and listening and good for a certain period of time. And if there's no more questions, I'll let you guys go free. And if you have questions in the past, like the last few weeks, I always finish class early for both my classes, but I always tend to leave at the same time because I always get questions afterwards. So feel free to come see me and ask me questions one-on-one if you want to after. Okay? So, hey.